Hello again and welcome to QED Stata 3, starting from part S33. So now we're just going to repeat the previous analysis. Instead of using gross, we use net primary enrolment. So because of the way we named these variables, it's actually really easy to do this in the do file. Because if you just take you can see this, if you just take this here and change everywhere it says gross to net, as I think it suggests in the footnote, so just select that. Press Control H, it brings up this, and change net, let's say change gross to net. And let's replace all, that will change all the grosses to nets. And then the other thing you need to do is to change the gross, that actually changes the gross here to nets as well, so that'll do it all in one go. So if you want to have a go at doing that, have a go, and I'll put it in just below the commands you need for that. Because obviously it's best to copy the whole thing and then paste it and then do the change. So you have both still recorded there. So we'll do that. So here's the commands pasted in and changed from gross to net. So we can execute all of that. Hopefully you should get a few graphs coming up. So start looking at how the results compare, and meanwhile I'll just rearrange the graphs on the screen where you're thinking about that, or you can pause it if you want more time for that. But actually I'll pause the video and rearrange the graphs. So here's the four charts. You can see this is net enrolment this time, so no values above 100. You can see that there's still a reasonably distinct correlation when you look at things, primary education and literacy in the same year. When you lag the primary education, so primary education 20 years previously compared with this year's literacy, it seems to increase the strength of the correlation quite distinctly there. And if you instead stick with the current year's primary education and look at literacy 20 years ago, it seems to weaken the correlation. And then 20 years ago, again, the correlation, if you're looking at stuff in the same year, the correlation is a grain higher because there's more variation. Everything's less clustered than it is here, with the primary levels of education. And then you can check that with the correlation coefficients in the main data results window. Okay, you've got the same thing. So really more distinct correlation this time between primary education, net, and literacy. But it strengthens when you lag the primary education variable, slightly weakens when you lag the literacy variable, suggesting that possibly more causality that way, even though it's still quite a crude way of approaching it, but it suggests that. And then in the past, slightly higher correlations, and then these here, as you'd expect, high, both primary and literacy high. So that's S33 and how the results compare. So again, it does strengthen the impression you get from the previous results and makes it clearer because they're using the net enrolment rather than gross. Okay, well, because so many countries now are quite high, folks succeeded in raising their primary enrolments. And if you're following education debates, the debates now in primary are more about the quality of that education rather than just getting people in the door. What about secondary education? How's that catching up, and what's the relationship between that and literacy? So we can get, just by copying those code commands and just adjusting them slightly, we can just quite easily look at the relationship between secondary enrolment and adult literacy. So what I'm going to do is in S34, I'll put in those two blocks of code for the gross and the net, and you can have a quick look at those. So if you want to pause your video and do that, I'll type those in as well. So here I've done that. Got exactly the same thing as previously, except I'll just replace everything with secondary. So we can just execute both those bits in one go. So here's the four graphs for secondary gross, and then the four graphs for secondary net. And I think what we'll do is we'll just look at the net ones, because as before, the net does give you a strong impression, except there's some missing data with the net because it wasn't so accurately recorded in the past. So there are some advantages in looking at gross with this. So if you want to pause it, I'll just rearrange them and then you can have a look at both. So I did do the gross graphs here as well, and laying that in the same way, give a similar picture, except here it seems that when you lag the secondary variable, if anything, it's not quite so strong, and when you lag the literacy variable, if anything, it's slightly stronger, and then that's maybe slightly stronger or similar 20 years previously. And that's confirmed when we look at the coefficients for that first one of the gross. So it seems that in this one, when you lag the literacy variable, it actually gives you a slightly stronger explanation than lagging the primary one. That's a very marginal difference. So it could be evidence that there is as much causality from improvements in literacy 20 years down the road are associated with higher levels of secondary education, rather than with primary it seems to flow the other way. And then just pause, I'll just rearrange the graph. So here's the net variables, which seems to tell a very similar story really. Slightly stronger correlations. Again, this time it seems that delaying primary education again, delaying the education, secondary education variable is not quite such a strong correlation, and similar correlation, pretty slightly stronger when you lag the literature variable. And again, there's quite a lot of missing observations, so here you get quite more patchy data. You compare that with the correlation coefficients. Again, it tells a similar story. That if anything, well, it's so close, it can't make any difference. But certainly evidence that causality seems to flow both ways. It's less asymmetrical than it is with primary education. And before we move away from the secondary education literacy thing, there have been claims, as you might know, about the particular impact of educating women. You can analyse that in various different ways, but we could just narrow in on secondary education of women compared with, say, literacy. So we'll put those lines in. So we want to pause and have a look at that. So here's some commands that will look at female secondary enrolment. So I've looked at female secondary and adult, looking at gross female enrolment, net female enrolment, and also I've looked at net female secondary enrolment and net primary enrolment. So the theorised connection between female enrolment and literacy is that it encourages greater primary enrolment. So we can look directly at that here. So if I do all three of these, what I'll do is instead of bringing up the scatter graphs, which look all at the same, I'll leave you to look at those, and we'll just concentrate on the correlation coefficients and see if there's anything in there. Just carry up these, so we'll do all the graphs, and yeah, so it gets quite interesting correlations. Sort of same kind of shapes as before. Yeah, so that's the lagging that's the no lags version. That's the literacy lags version. The no lags version up there. No lags version. So again, it has a similar kind of pattern to it. Yeah, and this is the one that's got the connection between primary enrolments and female education, female secondary education. Yeah. So if we look at what the correlation coefficients, rather than trying to sort through endless scatter graphs, which you can see on your own computer, just look at the story from the scatters. So female gross secondary enrolments and literacy, yeah, strong positive correlation. It looks though as though almost there's more of a connection between literacy and, so more literacy almost leading, or as strong an influence as there is the other way. If we look at the net, it's very, very similar figures. Yeah. So these things clearly are strongly correlated, the increases in female secondary enrolment and literacy. And also, if we look at the final one I did there, which was female education and primary enrolment. Again, it seems as though, looking at the difference here, that there's a strong positive correlation, but if you lag the female secondary enrolment, that's slightly weaker than it is looking at the primary enrolment going on to female enrolments. So it could be the joint causality there is at least as strong in each direction, possibly more from the primary enrolments. Okay, so there's a lot you can talk about there if you're interested in education. Meanwhile, I've lost so many things, I can't find the actual instructions. So if I had a good look at secondary enrolment and adult secondary enrolment and adult literacy, looking both in general and looking at female enrolment. So the final step is to see is any of that related to GDP per capita, but I'll leave that for the last video. So thanks for watching.